The iron shackles around Isabella Martinez's wrists had worn grooves into her skin over the past 3 days. She sat hunched on the wooden platform behind Murphy's trading post, her dark hair hanging like a curtain across her face, hiding the bruises that painted her cheekbones in shades of purple and yellow. 8 months pregnant, her swollen belly strained against the threadbare cotton dress that had once belonged to someone else, someone who probably hadn't ended up chained like livestock, waiting for the highest bidder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut through the Colorado territory like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Isabella pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Around her, men gathered in clusters, their voices low and calculating as they discussed her like she was a piece of farm equipment. "Look at the size of her," one man muttered, tobacco juice staining his grey beard. "Won't be good for much work until that baby comes. Might not survive the birthing," another added with a shrug. "Seen plenty of women her age die trying." Isabella kept her eyes fixed on the worn boards beneath her feet, counting the knots in the wood to keep from screaming. She had learned long ago that showing fear or anger only made things worse. The men who bought women at these auctions wanted either broken spirits they could control or fire they could eventually stamp out. She would give them neither. 3 months ago, she had been Isabella Santos, wife to Miguel Santos, living in a small but comfortable house on the outskirts of Pueblo. Miguel worked the copper mines, coming home each evening with dust in his lungs and silver coins in his pocket. They had been saving for the baby, planning to buy a little land, maybe start a small farm. Isabella had sewn tiny clothes by candlelight, humming Spanish lullabies her mother had sung to her. Then the mine collapsed. Miguel's body was never recovered, buried somewhere beneath tons of rock and shattered timber. The mining company offered her $20 for her husband's life and told her she had 1 week to vacate company housing. $20 wouldn't even cover Miguel's funeral, let alone support a pregnant woman with no family and no prospects. She had tried everything, worked as a seamstress until her fingers bled, but pregnant women moved too slowly to keep up with the piecework demands. She cleaned houses for wealthy families until one accused her of stealing a silver spoon that had merely been misplaced. She even swallowed her pride and begged the church for sanctuary, but Father Rodriguez told her that unwed mothers, he refused to acknowledge her marriage to Miguel since it hadn't been performed in his church, brought shame upon the congregation. "Ty," a baby kicked against her ribs, and Isabella placed a protective hand over her belly. She had sold everything of value, Miguel's tools, her wedding ring, even her mother's rosary. When the money ran out and the boarding house owner began looking at her with hungry eyes, she knew she had to run. She made it as far as Canyon City before the bounty hunters caught her. Jacob Harrison stood at the back of the crowd, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes the color of storm clouds. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had fought in wars and survived losses that would have broken lesser men. His ranch, the Double H, sprawled across 3,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Fremont County, but wealth hadn't softened the hard edges that grief had carved into his face. He hadn't come to the auction looking for a woman. He needed ranch hands, maybe a cook if he could find one who wouldn't run off at the first sign of real work. The auction block was one of the few places where a man could find workers willing to sign long-term contracts, even if those contracts weren't entirely voluntary. But when he saw Isabella on the platform, something twisted deep in his chest like a knife finding an old wound. She looked so much like Elena, the same delicate bone structure, the same way of holding her shoulders straight despite whatever weight she carried. Even the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear was achingly familiar. Jacob's hand unconsciously moved to the silver locket in his vest pocket, the one that held Elena's photograph and a curl of her dark hair. Elena Harrison had died 2 winters ago, along with their unborn child. The fever had taken them both in. The span of 3 terrible days, leaving Jacob alone in a house that suddenly felt as vast and empty as a tomb. He had buried them on the hill behind the house, beneath the oak tree where Elena used to sit and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Silas Murphy, climbed onto a wooden crate and raised his arms for attention. "Gentlemen, we have something special today. Young woman 8 months along, healthy as a horse despite recent circumstances. Starting bid is $50. A murmur ran through the crowd. $50 was steep for a woman so far. Along in pregnancy, especially one with no apparent skills beyond the obvious. "She's Mexican," called out a man in a bowler hat. Murphy consulted his ledger. "Half Mexican, half Irish, speaks English and Spanish both. Can read and write according to the paperwork." "What's she done to end up here?" another voice demanded. "Debtor. Husband died in a mine collapse, couldn't pay her bills. Clean record otherwise." Murphy's voice carried the practiced indifference of a man who had sold everything from cattle to children over the years. Isabella finally raised her head, and Jacob felt his breath catch in his throat. Those eyes, dark as midnight, filled with a defiance that reminded him so powerfully of Eleanor that for a moment he wondered if grief had finally driven him mad. 55, called the man in the bowler hat. 60, 75. The bidding climbed steadily. Jacob found himself studying Isabella's face, noting the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to look away even when men discussed her like property. Elena had been gentle where this woman seemed fierce, but there was something in the shape of her mouth, the arch of her eyebrows. $100! The shout came from a heavy-set man near the front of the crowd. Jacob recognized him as Garrett Walsh, owner of a cattle operation north of town. Walsh was known for working his hired help hard and paying them little. The women who worked in his house rarely stayed long, and those who left told stories that made decent folks cross themselves and look away. Isabella's composure cracked for just a moment, and Jacob saw fear flash across her features before she buried it again beneath a mask of resignation. 100 going at once, Murphy called. Jacob didn't know why he opened his mouth. The words came out before his rational mind could stop them. $200. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. $200 could buy a good horse or half a year's supplies. It was an absurd amount to pay for a pregnant woman. With no apparent skills. Murphy's eyes widened, but he recovered quickly. 200 from Mr. Harrison. Any other bids? Walsh turned to glare at Jacob, his small eyes narrowing. 250. 300, Jacob replied without hesitation. The crowd began to murmur and shift, sensing something more than a simple auction taking place. Walsh's face reddened, but he shook his head and stepped back. $300 was more than he was willing to spend on pride. 300 going once, twice, sold to Jacob Harrison. The sound of Murphy's gavel hitting wood seemed to echo in Jacob's chest like a second heartbeat. What had he just done? He owned cattle, horses, land, and buildings, but he had never owned another human being. The thought made his stomach turn, but it was too late to take it back now. Isabella's eyes found his across the crowd, and for a moment Jacob saw something that might have been gratitude flicker in their depths before disappearing behind walls of self-protection. Murphy approached, with his ledger and a set of papers. Need your signature here, Mr. Harrison. Contract standard, 5 years' labor to work off the debt, plus room, board, and basic necessities. She's yours to do with as you see fit. Within the bounds of Christian decency, of course. Jacob signed. his name with a hand that was steadier than he felt. $300. Elena's funeral had cost less than that. What would she think of him now? Buying a woman like a head of cattle. But as Murphy unlocked the shackles from Isabella's wrists, revealing the raw, abraded skin beneath, Jacob told himself he had done the right thing. Whatever his reasons, this woman would be safer on his ranch than in Garrett Walsh's hands. Isabella stood slowly, one hand braced against her lower back. Up close, Jacob could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, the way she favored her left foot as if it pained her. She was younger than Elena had been, probably no more than 22 or 23, but hardship had aged her beyond her years. "Ma'am," Jacob said quietly, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Jacob Harrison. My ranch is about an hour's ride from here." Isabella studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but steady. "Isabella Santos." "Martinez," Murphy corrected, consulting his papers. "Says here, Isabella Martinez." A flicker of pain crossed Isabella's features. "Santos was my married name, my husband." She trailed off, then lifted her chin. "Santos." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob nodded. "Mrs. Santos it is, then." He had brought his wagon to town, intending to load supplies for the winter. Now he helped Isabella climb onto the bench seat, noting how carefully she moved, how she bit her lip to keep from crying out. When the baby's weight shifted, her condition was more advanced than he had initially thought. This child would come soon, probably within the next few weeks. As they rode out of Canyon City, Isabella kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and unacknowledged fears. "Mrs. Santos," Jacob finally said as they turned onto the mountain road that led to his ranch, "I want you to know that I didn't buy you for, that is, I won't be expecting—" Isabella turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised. "What won't you be expecting, Mr. Harrison?" Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean to say that you'll have your own room, your own space. I need help around the ranch, but I won't force you into anything you don't agree to. And after 5 years, you'll be free to go wherever you choose." Isabella was quiet for so long that Jacob wondered if she had heard him. Finally, she spoke. "Men don't usually spend $300 on charity, Mr. Harrison. What is it you really want from me?" It was a fair question, and one Jacob wasn't sure he could answer honestly. How could he explain that seeing her on that auction block had felt like watching Eleanor die all over again? How could he tell her that for just a moment, when their eyes met, he had felt something other than the cold emptiness that had lived in his chest for 2 years? "I suppose," he said carefully, "I want to believe that not everything good in this world has to die." Isabella studied his profile as he drove, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with easy competence. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain they had never met. Maybe it was just that he looked like the kind of man Miguel might have become if he had lived long enough, weathered by hard work, but not broken by it, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned his place in the world. Vestillo. Baby kicked again, harder this time, and Isabella pressed both hands to her belly. The child was restless today, as if sensing the upheaval in her life. She whispered a quiet prayer in Spanish, asking the Virgin Mary to watch over them both in whatever was to come. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter and tried not to think about winter coming, about giving birth in a stranger's house, about the 5 years of servitude stretching ahead of her like a sentence in prison. But when she glanced at Jacob Harrison's profile again, She saw something in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he handled the horses, that made her think he might be a man who kept his word. In her experience, that was rarer than gold and twice as valuable. The Double H Ranch spread before them as they crested the final hill, and Isabella caught her breath at the sight. The main house was built of honey-colored logs and river stone, with a wraparound porch that looked out over a valley carpeted in autumn gold. Cattle dotted the pastures like dark punctuation marks against the grass, and a creek ran silver through the center of it all, catching the late afternoon light. It was beautiful, in a way that made her chest ache with longing. This was the kind of place she and Miguel had dreamed of owning someday, the kind of place where a child could grow up with dirt under their fingernails and stars in their eyes. But it wasn't hers. It would never be hers. She was here as property, bought and paid for, and she would do well to remember that. Jacob pulled the wagon up to the front porch and set the brake. "Welcome to Double H, Mrs. Santos." Isabella climbed down from the wagon carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride. The baby seemed to have settled for the moment, but she could feel the tightness across her belly that meant her time was growing short. The front door opened, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked, brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She wore a simple blue dress, covered by a white apron that looked well-used but clean. "Jacob," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent. "You didn't mention you'd be bringing a guest. Mrs. O'Brien, this is Isabella Santos. She'll be staying with us." Jacob's voice was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of the circumstances that had brought Isabella here. Mrs. O'Brien's eyes took in Isabella's condition, the exhaustion in her face, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. The older woman's expression softened with understanding. "Well then, Mrs. Santos, you look about ready to drop where you stand. Come inside and let me fix you something warm to drink. You can tell me when that baby's due, while Jacob brings in your things." Isabella glanced at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. "Mrs. O'Brien has been taking care of this place longer than I've owned it. You can trust her." As Isabella followed Mrs. O'Brien into the house, she caught a glimpse of Jacob watching them go, his expression unreadable. Whatever game he was playing, whatever he truly wanted from her, she would have to figure it out as she went. For now, she was just grateful to be somewhere warm, somewhere that smelled of fresh bread and coffee instead of unwashed men and desperation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she would rest and try to prepare for whatever was coming. The baby kicked once more, as if to remind her that some things couldn't wait for convenient timing. Isabella placed a protective hand over her belly and whispered another prayer. She was going to need all the help she could get. The guest room on the second floor of the Double H Ranch house had clearly been prepared for someone special. Isabella stood in the doorway, taking in the polished oak furniture, the hand-stitched quilt in shades of blue and cream, and the porcelain wash basin with matching pitcher. Lace curtains filtered the afternoon light into soft patterns on the hardwood floor, and a small fireplace promised warmth against the mountain cold. "This is too fine," Isabella said quietly, her hand resting on the doorframe. "I'm hired help. Mrs. O'Brien, I shouldn't be staying in the family quarters." Margaret O'Brien bustled past her into the room, setting down a stack of fresh towels and checking that the water pitcher was full. "Nonsense. Mr. Harrison was very specific about your accommodations. Besides," she added with a meaningful glance, at Isabella's swollen belly, "a woman in your condition needs proper rest, not a cot in the bunkhouse." Isabella moved carefully to the window, looking out over the ranch yard where Jacob was unhitching the horses from the wagon. Even from this distance, she could see the easy competence in his movements, the way the animals responded to his quiet commands, Miguel had been good with horses too, she remembered with a pang of grief that still caught her off guard. "How long have you worked for Mr. Harrison?" Isabella asked, settling into the rocking chair by the window with a soft grunt of relief. Mrs. O'Brien's hands stilled on the quilt she was smoothing. "Near on 15 years now. Started when Mr. Jacob was just a young man, newly married, and full of dreams about building something lasting up here in the mountains. He was married. Oh yes, to the sweetest girl you ever did see. Elena Harrison. Rest her soul." Mrs. O'Brien crossed herself automatically. "Lost her to the fever 2 winters past, along with their first child. Near killed Mr. Jacob, losing them both like that." Isabella's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. She understood that particular kind of loss, the way it hollowed you, out from the inside until you wondered if you'd ever feel whole again. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible for him. Changed him, it did. Used to be he'd whistle while he worked, always had a joke or a kind word for the ranch hands. These days he keeps to himself mostly, works from dawn to dusk, like he's trying to outrun something that's chasing him." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Jacob's voice came through the wood, carefully formal. "Mrs. Santos, I have your belongings from the wagon." Isabella looked around in confusion. "I don't have any belongings, Mr. Harrison." The door opened slowly, and Jacob entered carrying a worn leather satchel and a small wooden crate. His eyes avoided hers as he set them down by the dresser. "Murphy had these listed as your personal effects. Thought you might want them." Isabella's heart lurched as she recognized Miguel's old tool bag and the wooden box she had packed with their few precious memories before the boarding house owner had seized everything else for unpaid rent. She had thought they were lost forever. "How did you?" she began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You paid Murphy extra for them," Jacob shrugged, his discomfort obvious. "Seemed like the right thing to do." Isabella rose from the chair with some difficulty and moved to the wooden box. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid to reveal Miguel's pocket watch, their marriage certificate written in Spanish, a few letters he had sent her during their brief courtship, and the small silver cross that had belonged to her mother. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed the cross to her lips, whispering a prayer of gratitude in Spanish. "I thought I'd lost everything," she whispered. "Everything that proved he existed, that we existed." Jacob shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "I'll leave you to get settled. Mrs. O'Brien, perhaps you could show Mrs. Santos around the house. When she's ready." He was gone before either woman could respond, his boots echoing down the hallway like retreat. Mrs. O'Brien clucked her tongue sympathetically. "He's not used to tears, poor man. Hasn't seen any since he lost Elena, and before that, well, let's just say Mr. Jacob learned early that showing emotion was often seen as weakness." Isabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What do you mean?" "His father was a hard man, from what Elena told me. Military background, expected his sons to be soldiers even as boys. Mr. Jacob's older brother died in the war. Gettysburg, I think it was. After that, the old man got even harder. Like he was trying to make sure Jacob wouldn't break the way Thomas did." "Thomas? The brother?" "Jacob never talks about him, but Elena said he carried Thomas's pocket watch and blamed himself for not being there when it happened." Mrs. O'Brien moved to the window, watching Jacob in the yard below. "I think that's why losing Elena hit him so hard. She was the first person who made him feel like it was safe to love something." Isabella sank back into the rocking chair, processing this information. She had assumed Jacob Harrison was just another wealthy rancher, with more money than conscience, the type who thought buying a woman's servitude was a reasonable business transaction. But the man Mrs. O'Brien described sounded more complicated, damaged in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of herself. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly sharp kick to her ribs, making her gasp and grab the arms of the chair. "How far along are you, dear?" Mrs. O'Brien asked, moving to kneel beside the chair with practiced concern. 8 months, maybe a little more. It's hard to know exactly when. Isabella trailed off, unwilling to remember the circumstances of the baby's conception. That part of her story was too raw, too shameful to share with this kind woman who looked at her with such maternal concern. Mrs. O'Brien's experienced hands gently felt the shape of Isabella's belly, her expression growing thoughtful. "This little one's dropped quite a bit. I'd say you have maybe 2 weeks, possibly less. Have you felt any pains, any tightening?" "Some," Isabella admitted. "More today than before, especially during the wagon ride." "Well then, we'll need to get Dr. Morrison out here soon to check on you both. He delivered all of Elena's. That is, he's very good with expectant mothers." Isabella caught the correction and the pain behind it. How many times had Elena Harrison lost babies before the final tragedy that claimed both mother and child? She found herself wondering what Elena had been like, this woman whose memory still cast such a long shadow over the ranch. "Mrs. O'Brien, may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear. Why do you think Mr. Harrison bought me? He could have hired any number of women to help around the ranch, women who weren't—" She gestured to her belly. "Women who could actually work." Mrs. O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands smoothing Isabella's hair back from her face with motherly tenderness. "I've been wondering the same thing since he rode in with you. Mr. Jacob's not an impulsive man. He thinks everything through twice before acting. But when I saw his face as he helped you down from that wagon—" "What about his face?" "He looked like he'd seen a ghost." That evening, Isabella joined Jacob and Mrs. O'Brien for dinner in the ranch house's spacious kitchen. The meal was simple but hearty. Beef stew with fresh bread and butter, green beans from Mrs. O'Brien's garden, and apple pie that smelled like heaven. Isabella couldn't remember the last time she had eaten food that wasn't scraps or charity. Jacob sat at the head of the long wooden table, his movements economical as he ate. He had changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, and Isabella noticed that his hands, though calloused from ranch work, were well kept. This was a man who took care with details, who maintained standards even in the isolation of mountain life. "The Hendersons' boy came by this afternoon," Mrs. O'Brien said, passing a bowl of stew to Isabella. "Said they're planning to drive their cattle down to the railroad before the first snow. Wondered if you wanted to join the drive?" Jacob considered this, cutting his bread with precise movements. "Might be wise. Weather's been unpredictable lately, and if we get an early blizzard, we could lose the whole herd." "When would you leave?" Isabella asked, then immediately regretted speaking. She wasn't family, or even a real employee. She had no right to involve herself in ranch business, but Jacob looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "Probably next week. It's a 5-day drive to the railhead in Colorado Springs." "Why do you ask?" Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. If the baby comes while you're gone." "Dr. Morrison will be here tomorrow to check on you," Mrs. O'Brien said quickly, "and I've delivered more babies than I care to count. You'll be in good hands." Jacob set down his fork, studying Isabella's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Are you worried about something specific, Mrs. Santos?" The question was asked gently, but Isabella heard the underlying concern. She realized that despite everything, the auction, the contract, the circumstances that had brought her here, Jacob Harrison was trying to be kind to her. The realization was so unexpected that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face with her napkin. "I don't mean to be emotional. It's just that I've been alone for so long, and the thought of having the baby without Miguel, without her mother, who had died when Isabella was 16, without anyone who loved her enough to hold her hand through the pain and fear." Jacob's expression softened. "You're not alone now." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than Isabella thought he intended. She looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch, a loneliness that matched her own, a grief that understood the shape of loss. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "why did you really buy me today?" Mrs. O'Brien made a small sound of alarm. "Isabella, dear, perhaps that's not—" "No, it's all right," Jacob said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving to the window where the last light of day painted the mountains purple. "Would you believe me if I said I don't entirely—" "No? I'd believe you were being honest." Jacob's mouth curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "When I saw you on that platform today, something about you reminded me of someone I lost. Not just in how you looked, but in the way you held yourself, like you were determined not to break, no matter what they did to you." Isabella felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of suspicion she had carried since Canyon City. "Your wife?" "Yes." The word was barely audible. Elena had that same strength. She faced everything, illness, loss, disappointment, with her chin up and her shoulders straight. Even at the end, when the fever was taking her, she was more worried. "About me than herself." Mrs. O'Brien rose quietly and began clearing the dishes, her movements deliberately noisy to cover the intimacy of the conversation. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Isabella said. "She was." Jacob turned his attention back to Isabella, and she saw him really looking at her for the first time since they had met. "You have that same quality. Whatever brought you to that auction, whatever you've been through, you haven't let it defeat you." Isabella thought about the weeks of hunger, the nights spent hiding in alleys, the humiliation of being sold like livestock. "Some days, I'm not so sure about that. The fact that you're still fighting for your child's future tells me everything I need to know about your character." The baby kicked then, as if responding to the conversation, and Isabella couldn't help but smile. This little one certainly has opinions about things. "May I?" Jacob asked, gesturing toward her belly. Isabella hesitated. The request was intimate, presumptuous even, but something in his voice made her nod. Jacob rose and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair. When he placed his large, work-roughened hand on her belly, Isabella felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her dress. The baby immediately responded with a series of strong kicks, as if showing off. Jacob's face transformed with wonder. "My God, he's strong." "She," Isabella corrected automatically, then paused. "At least I hope it's a she. I've always imagined having a daughter." "Eleanor always wanted a daughter too," Jacob said softly, his hand still resting on Isabella's belly. "Said she'd name her Rose, after her grandmother." Something cold crawled up Isabella's spine. Rose? Family name. Elena's grandmother, Rose Santos, was quite a woman from what I heard. Came to Colorado Territory as a young bride, built a life here despite all the hardships. The room began to spin around Isabella. Rose Santos. Her grandmother's name had been Rose Santos, the woman who had raised her mother after Isabella's grandfather had died in a mining accident, the woman whose stories had filled Isabella's childhood with dreams of adventure and courage. What was Elena's maiden name?" Isabella whispered. Jacob looked up at her, concerned by the change in her voice. "Santos, Elena Santos Harrison. Why?" Isabella's vision grayed at the edges. Elena Santos, her sister Elena, who had run away from home when Isabella was just 12 years old, who had disappeared one night, leaving only a note saying she was going to find a better life in the mountains. Elena, who their mother had mourned as dead for 10 years. Elena, who had been dead for 2 years now, buried on a hill behind this very house. The chair spun beneath her, and Isabella felt herself falling into darkness, even as she heard Jacob calling her name from what seemed like a great distance. The last coherent thought she had before unconsciousness claimed her was that she had married her dead sister's husband, and he had no idea who she really was. Isabella woke to the sound of rain drumming against the windows and the gentle crackling of a fire in the small fireplace. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why her body felt so heavy and strange. Then the memories came flooding back. The auction, Jacob Harrison, the revelation about Elena, and she pressed her hands to her face with a soft moan. "Easy now, dear one." Dr. Morrison's voice was calm and reassuring as he moved into her line of vision. He was a compact man in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "You gave us quite a scare." Isabella struggled to sit up, but the doctor's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her lying down. "How long was I unconscious?" "About an hour. Mr. Harrison carried you up here after you fainted. Your pulse is strong, but your blood pressure is elevated." Dr. Morrison pulled a stethoscope from his medical bag. "May I examine you? I need to check on both you and the baby." Isabella nodded, acutely aware that Jacob was probably somewhere in the house, waiting to hear if she was all right. Jacob, who had no idea that the woman he had bought at auction was his dead wife's sister. The irony was so twisted, it made her stomach churn. Dr. Morrison's examination was thorough but gentle. He listened to the baby's heartbeat, measured Isabella's belly, and checked her reflexes with practiced efficiency. Throughout it all, Isabella's mind raced with impossible questions. Should she tell Jacob the truth? How could she explain that she was Elena's sister without revealing that she had known Elena was dead before coming here? And what would happen when he learned that the woman he thought was a stranger carried his wife's family name? "The baby is in excellent health," Dr. Morrison announced, packing his instruments back into his bag. "Strong heartbeat, good position for delivery. However, I'm concerned about you, young lady. Stress and exhaustion can be dangerous in your condition." "I'll be fine," Isabella said automatically. "Will you?" The doctor's shrewd eyes studied her face. "Mrs. Santos, I've been delivering babies in this territory for 20 years. I can tell the difference between normal pregnancy fatigue and the kind of emotional shock that can put both mother and child at risk." Isabella turned her face toward the window, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass. "Sometimes life gives you information you're not prepared to handle. Would it help to talk about it?" Before Isabella could answer, a soft knock came at the door. Jacob's voice carried through the wood, carefully controlled, but edged with worry. "Dr. Morrison? Is she—" "Come in, Jacob," the doctor called. "Mrs. Santos is awake, and both she and the baby are doing well." Jacob entered the room with the cautious movements of a man approaching a spooked horse. His hair was damp from the rain, and Isabella noticed he had changed into a fresh shirt. The white cotton made his grey eyes seem almost silver in the firelight. "How are you feeling?" he asked, stopping at the foot of the bed. "Better," Isabella lied. "I'm sorry for frightening you." "Dr. Morrison, what caused her to collapse?" Jacob's question was directed at the doctor, but his eyes never left Isabella's face. "Exhaustion, stress, the physical demands of advanced pregnancy," Dr. Morrison said diplomatically. "Mrs. Santos has been through quite an ordeal recently. Her body is telling her to rest." Jacob's jaw tightened. "The auction. I should have realized how difficult today would be for her." "Mr. Harrison," Isabella said quickly, "you've been nothing but kind to me. This isn't your fault." Something flickered across Jacob's features. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Still, I think it would be best if I postponed the cattle drive, at least until after—" "Absolutely not," Isabella protested, struggling to sit up. "You can't change your business plans because of me. I'll be fine with Mrs. O'Brien, and Dr. Morrison said the baby isn't due for another 2 weeks." "Babies don't follow calendars," Dr. Morrison observed mildly. This little one could arrive any time in the next few days to 2 weeks. But Mrs. Santos is right. There's no medical reason why Mr. Harrison couldn't make his planned trip, assuming proper arrangements are made here. Jacob moved closer to the bed, his expression troubled. Mrs. Santos, you collapsed during dinner. That's not something I can easily ignore. Please, Isabella said, and she could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. I don't want to be responsible for costing you money or business opportunities. I've caused enough trouble already. You haven't caused any trouble. I fainted at your dinner table an hour after arriving at your home. Most people would call that trouble. Jacob was quiet for a moment, studying her face with that unnerving intensity she was beginning to recognize. Most people didn't spend $300 to buy you out of a much worse situation. The reminder of her circumstances and the debt she owed him hit Isabella like a physical blow. She was property now, bound to him for 5 years, whether she liked it or not. The fact that he was being kind to her didn't change the fundamental reality of their relationship. Of course, she said quietly. I apologize for forgetting my place. Jacob's expression darkened. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Isabella met his gaze directly. You own me, Mr. Harrison. For the next 5 years, my well-being is your investment to protect. I understand the economics of the situation. Jacob, Dr. Morrison said carefully, perhaps I should speak with Mrs. Santos alone for a moment. Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but after a tense moment, he nodded. I'll be downstairs when you're finished. After he left, Dr. Morrison pulled the rocking chair closer to the bed and sat down heavily. That was unnecessarily cruel, young lady. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was being realistic. You were being self-destructive. Jacob Harrison is one of the finest men I know, and he's trying to help you. Throwing his kindness back in his face won't protect you from whatever you're really afraid of. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me. Isabella looked into the doctor's kind, weathered face and felt the overwhelming urge to confess everything. About Elena, about the impossible coincidence that had brought her here, about the secret that was eating her alive. But how could she explain without sounding completely insane? Dr. Morrison, she said carefully, what can you tell me about Mrs. Harrison? Elena, the doctor's expression grew guarded. Why do you ask? Mr. Harrison mentioned that she died in childbirth. As someone in my condition, I'm naturally concerned about... Elena didn't die in childbirth, Dr. Morrison said gently. She contracted typhoid fever during her 8th month of pregnancy. The fever took both her and the baby within 3 days. There were no complications with the pregnancy itself. Isabella nodded, filing away this information, while her heart ached for the sister she had never had the chance to know as an adult. What was she like? Dr. Morrison smiled, his eyes growing distant with memory. Eleanor was special. She had a way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered. Kind, intelligent, with a laugh that could light up a room. She loved this. Ranch loved Jacob with a devotion that was beautiful to witness. Did she ever mention having a family? Brothers or sisters? The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. She spoke occasionally of her childhood, but always in general terms. I got the impression there had been some family difficulties. She never received letters or visitors from home. Jacob mentioned once that she had run away from an unhappy situation when she was quite young. Isabella's throat tightened. Elena had never tried to contact their mother, even after all these years. Had she been so desperate to escape their childhood home that she had cut all ties completely? Dr. Morrison, if someone had information about Elena's family, information that might be important, would you think they should share it with Mr. Harrison? The doctor leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. What kind of information? Isabella hesitated at the edge of the precipice. Once she spoke the words, There would be no taking them back. Hypothetically, what if Elena had family members she never told Jacob about? People who might still be alive. I think, Dr. Morrison said slowly, that Jacob deserves to know about. Anyone who was important to Elena. He spent 2 years believing she died completely alone in the world, except for him. If that's not true, a soft knock interrupted them, and Mrs. O'Brien peered around the door. Forgive me, Doctor, but there's a situation developing downstairs that needs attention. Dr. Morrison rose with a sigh. What kind of situation? Mr. Henderson's boy rode over in the rain. Says their youngest daughter is burning up with fever and asking for you to come right away. The doctor was already reaching for his coat. Mrs. Santos, you need complete bed rest for the next 24 hours. No getting up except for necessities, no strenuous activity, and absolutely no more emotional shocks if you can help it. After he left, Mrs. O'Brien bustled around the room, adjusting pillows and stoking the fire. Poor little Susie Henderson. She's only 6 years old, and with this weather— Mrs. O'Brien, Isabella said impulsively, how much do you know about Elena's life before she married Mr. Harrison? The older woman paused in her tidying. Not much, I'm afraid. She was very private about her past. I always got the feeling there were painful memories she preferred not to discuss. Did she ever mention family? Once or twice, but never in detail. Mrs. O'Brien sat on the edge of the bed, her expression growing thoughtful. I remember she received a letter once, about 3 years ago. It upset her terribly. She cried for hours after reading it. Mr. Jacob tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't tell him what was wrong. Isabella's pulse quickened. Do you know who the letter was from? No, but I remember she burned it in the kitchen fireplace that same night. Said some things were better left buried. Mrs. O'Brien studied Isabella's face with growing concern. My dear, why all these questions about Elena? Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of secrets pressing down on her like stones. That letter, it had probably been from their mother, perhaps telling Elena about Isabella's marriage to Miguel, or their mother's failing health. Elena had burned it rather than share the news with Jacob, choosing to keep her family separate. From her new life, I'm just trying to understand what kind of woman inspired such devotion, Isabella said finally. Mr. Harrison clearly loved her very much. That he did. But you know, dear, I've been watching him today and I haven't seen him this animated in 2 years. Worried, yes, but alive in a way he hasn't been since we lost Elena. What do you mean? Mrs. O'Brien smoothed the quilt with careful hands. When you collapsed at dinner, the look on his face. It was the same expression he wore when Elena took sick. Like he was ready to fight death itself to protect you. Isabella's breath caught. Mrs. O'Brien, I'm just a woman he bought at auction. He barely knows me. Maybe so. But I've lived long enough to recognize when a man is starting to care about a woman, and Mr. Jacob is definitely starting to care about you. Mrs. O'Brien rose and moved toward the door. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Alone again, Isabella stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through the impossible tangle of her situation. Jacob was beginning to care for her, not because of who she was, but because she reminded him of Elena. If he learned the truth about her identity, would that make his feelings stronger, or would it destroy them completely? She thought about Elena, burning that letter, choosing to keep her past separate from her new life. Maybe her sister had been wiser than Isabella had given her credit for. Maybe some secrets were meant to stay buried. But as the baby moved restlessly inside her, and the rain continued to drum against the windows, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that the truth had a way of surfacing, whether you wanted it to or not. And when it did, it might destroy everything Jacob thought he knew about the woman he had loved and the woman he was beginning to care for. The storm outside intensified as evening fell, and with it came an unexpected visitor. Isabella was dozing fitfully when the sound of urgent voices from downstairs roused her. She sat up carefully, straining to hear what was happening. "Rode through the storm to get here," a man's voice was saying. "Said it was urgent." Jacob's reply was too low to make out, but she heard footsteps on the stairs and then a knock at her door. "Mrs. Santos?" Jacob's voice was carefully neutral. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's someone here who says he knows you, a man named Carlos Martinez." Isabella's blood turned to ice. Carlos Martinez was her mother's cousin, a man she hadn't seen in over a year. What could possibly have brought him here through a storm to Jacob's ranch? "I'll be down in a moment," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. "Are you sure you're well enough?" "Yes, I'm fine." Isabella dressed quickly in the simple brown dress Mrs. O'Brien had mended for her, braided her hair back, and made her way downstairs on unsteady legs. In the front parlor, she found Jacob standing near the fireplace with a man she barely recognized. Carlos. Martinez had aged dramatically since she had last seen him. His hair was completely grey now, his face deeply lined with worry and exhaustion. His clothes were soaked from the storm, and he held his hat in hands that trembled slightly. When he saw Isabella, his weathered face crumpled with relief. "Isabella. Mija, thank God I found you." "Carlos?" Isabella moved toward him cautiously. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "I've been searching for weeks, following rumors, asking questions in every town between here and Pueblo." Carlos glanced nervously at Jacob, then back to Isabella. "Mija, I have news from home about your mama." Isabella's knees nearly buckled. "Is she alive, but very sick? The consumption has gotten worse, and she's been asking for you, begging me to find you and bring you home." Jacob stepped forward, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Mrs. Santos, do you need to sit down?" Isabella shook her head, though the room was spinning slightly. "Carlos, I can't leave right now. As you can see, I'm expecting a child very soon." Carlos's eyes took in her condition with obvious shock. "Dios mío, Isabella, when Miguel died, your mama said you had disappeared. We thought maybe you had, that the grief had... Miguel is dead." Jacob's voice cut through the conversation, like a blade. Isabella turned to face him, seeing the questions forming in his storm-grey eyes. "My husband died in a mine collapse 3 months ago." "Your husband?" Jacob's voice was flat, carefully controlled. "You told Murphy at the auction that your name was Martinez. Santos was my married name. Martinez is my maiden name." Isabella lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "My full name is Isabella Martinez Santos." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a flicker of recognition that made Isabella's heart pound with sudden fear. Carlos, oblivious to the undercurrents in the room, continued speaking. "Isabella, your mama doesn't have much time. The doctor says maybe a few weeks, maybe less. She wants to see her grandbaby before—" He trailed off, looking between Isabella and Jacob with growing awareness that he had walked into a complicated situation. "Carlos," Isabella said carefully, "this is Jacob Harrison. He's helping me during my pregnancy." Carlos nodded politely to Jacob, then turned back to Isabella. "I know the journey would be hard in your condition, but if we leave tomorrow, we could make it to Pueblo in 4 days. Your mama has money saved. She can pay this man for any inconvenience." "Mrs. Santos isn't going anywhere," Jacob said quietly. But there was steel beneath his calm tone. "She's under contract to work here for 5 years. Carlos's face flushed with anger. "Contract? What kind of contract?" Isabella closed her eyes, knowing what was coming. "Carlos, I was sold at a debtor's auction in Canyon City. Mr. Harrison bought my contract." The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos stared at Isabella in horror, then turned to Jacob with fury blazing in his dark eyes. "You bought her? Like an animal?" "It's not what you think," Jacob said, but Carlos was already moving toward him with fists clenched. "You took advantage of a pregnant woman in desperate circumstances, and you call that helping her? Carlos, stop!" Isabella stepped between the two men, one hand pressed to her belly as the baby responded to her distress with violent kicks. "Mr. Harrison saved me from a much worse situation. Without him, I would have been bought by a man who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but understanding dawned in Carlos's eyes. His anger deflated slightly, replaced by a deep sadness. "Ay, mija, what has this world done to you?" Isabella felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "I had no choice, Carlos. I had nowhere else to go." Jacob was watching this exchange with an expression Isabella couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Mr. Martinez, I understand your concern for Mrs. Santos, but she's in no condition to travel, especially through mountain passes in this weather. Perhaps we could discuss arrangements for after the baby is born." Carlos looked between them, clearly, struggling with the situation. "Isabella, is this what you want? To stay here with this man?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella realized that everyone in the room was waiting for her answer. Carlos, who wanted to take her home to their dying mother. Jacob, who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had experienced in months. And herself, torn between duty, gratitude, and a growing awareness that her feelings toward Jacob Harrison were becoming dangerously complicated. She began, then stopped as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She doubled over with a gasp, and suddenly both men were at her side. "The baby," she whispered, as another contraction gripped her like a vice. I think it's time." The storm that had been building all evening finally unleashed its full fury as Isabella's labor began in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows like angry fists, and thunder rolled across the mountains with such violence that the house seemed to shake with each rumble. Inside the ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing as 3 lives collided in ways none of them could have anticipated. "Get her upstairs," Mrs. O'Brien commanded, appearing in the parlor doorway with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergency childbirths before. Her gray hair was already escaping its neat bun, and she carried an armload of clean towels. "Mr. Harrison, send Carlos to fetch Dr. Morrison immediately. Tell him the baby's coming fast." Jacob swept Isabella into his arms without hesitation, ignoring her weak protests that she could walk. As he carried her up the stairs, another contraction gripped her, and she cried out, her fingernails digging into his shoulders through his shirt. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry for what I said earlier. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I—" "Hush," Jacob said firmly, shouldering open the door to her room. "None of that matters now. Just focus on bringing this baby safely into the world." Mrs. O'Brien had already prepared the bed with layers of clean sheets and towels. She helped Isabella out of her dress and into a cotton nightgown, her movements gentle but urgent. Through the window, they could see Carlos riding hard through the rain toward town, his horse's hooves throwing up sprays of mud in the lamplight from the yard. "The storm's getting worse," Mrs. O'Brien observed, checking Isabella's pulse. "Even if Carlos reaches Dr. Morrison, they might not be able to get back here tonight." Another contraction hit, stronger than the last, and Isabella bit back a scream. Jacob moved to the window, ostensibly to watch for the doctor's arrival, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the windowsill. "Mr. Harrison," she managed between pants, "you don't have to stay. This isn't your responsibility." Jacob turned from the window, his gray eyes blazing, with an intensity that took her breath away. "Like hell it isn't." The vehemence in his voice surprised them all. Mrs. O'Brien glanced between Jacob and Isabella with raised eyebrows, but she said nothing as she continued her preparations. Over the next hour, Isabella's labor progressed with a speed that alarmed Mrs. O'Brien. The contractions were coming faster now, harder, and Isabella found herself gripping Jacob's hand with a strength that would have surprised her if she'd been capable of rational thought. "Talk to me," she gasped during a brief respite between pains. "Tell me something, anything. I need to hear your voice." Jacob looked uncertain for a moment, then began speaking in a low, steady tone. "When Elena and I first came to this ranch, it was nothing but raw land and a half-built cabin. We spent our first winter in 2 rooms with gaps in the walls so wide you could see daylight through them." Despite her pain, Isabella found herself listening intently. This was the most Jacob had ever spoken about Elena, and each word felt like a piece of a puzzle she desperately needed to solve. She never complained, not once, even when the snow blew through the cracks and we woke up with ice in the water. Picture, she'd just laugh and say we were having an adventure. Jacob's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of Isabella's hand. She had this way of finding joy in the smallest things. A perfect sunset, a wildflower blooming in an unexpected place, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Another contraction seized Isabella, and she squeezed Jacob's hand so hard she was afraid she might break his fingers. When it passed, she was crying, not just from the physical pain, but from the emotional agony of hearing him talk about Elena with such love while knowing what she knew. "She sounds wonderful," Isabella whispered, and the words felt like glass. In her throat, she was. Jacob's voice was soft with memory. She used to sing while she worked, Spanish lullabies her grandmother had taught her. That music made everything easier, even the hardest tasks. Isabella's breath caught. Their grandmother Rose had sung those same lullabies to both sisters when they were children. Elena had taught them to Isabella during long summer evenings when their parents were fighting and they needed comfort. What were the songs? Isabella asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Jacob's face grew thoughtful. There was one she sang most often, something about a little bird, pajarito que cantas. I never learned all the words, but the melody was beautiful. Isabella's tears came harder now. Pajarito que cantas en la laguna, no despiertes al niño que está en la cuna. The lullaby flowed from her lips in her grandmother's voice, the same melody Elena had sung to comfort her when she was small. Jacob went very still. "How do you know that song?" Before Isabella could answer, another contraction hit with such force that she screamed. Mrs. O'Brien appeared at her side, checking her progress with practiced efficiency. "The baby's crowning," she announced. "Isabella, dear, you need to push with the next contraction." Everything became a blur of pain and effort. Isabella pushed when Mrs. O'Brien told her to, panted when instructed to rest, and held on to Jacob's. Hand-like, it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Dimly, she was aware of voices outside. Carlos had returned with Dr. Morrison, but the storm was too fierce for them to risk crossing the flooded creek between town and the ranch. "You're doing beautifully," Jacob murmured in her ear during a brief pause. "Elena would be proud of your strength." The comment was meant to be encouraging, but it hit Isabella like a physical blow. Elena would be proud. Elena, who had never known that her little sister had grown up, married, lost her husband, and was now giving birth in the very house where Elena had died. "Jacob," Isabella gasped, knowing she was about to cross a line. She could never uncross. "There's something I need to tell you, about Elena, about me." "Later," he said firmly. "After the baby comes, whatever it is can wait." But Isabella shook her head frantically. "No, it can't. You don't understand. Another massive contraction cut off her words, and Mrs. O'Brien was shouting encouragement. "Push, Isabella! I can see the head." Isabella bore down with everything she had, and suddenly there was a rush of sensation and relief. The room filled with the sound of a baby's angry wail, strong and clear and unmistakably alive. "A girl!" Mrs. O'Brien announced, lifting a squirming, red-faced bundle. "A perfect, healthy girl!" Isabella collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted, but exhilarated. Jacob was staring at the baby with an expression of wonder that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. Mrs. O'Brien quickly cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket before placing her in Isabella's arms. The infant was beautiful, dark hair like Isabella's, but with features that were definitely her own. As Isabella looked down at her daughter, she felt a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. "What will you call her?" Jacob asked, softly, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny fist with one gentle finger. Isabella looked up at him, seeing the naked emotion in his face, and made a decision that would change everything. "Elena. I want to name her Elena." The silence that followed was profound. Jacob's hand stilled on the baby's blanket, and his eyes moved slowly from the infant to Isabella's face. "Why?" he asked quietly. Isabella took a shaking breath, knowing that once she spoke the words, there would be no taking them back. "Because Elena Santos was my sister." The color drained from Jacob's face. "What did you say?" "Elena Santos Harrison was my older sister. She ran away from home when I was 12 years old. We never heard from her again until—" Isabella's voice broke. "Until I heard her married name at your dinner table tonight." Jacob stood up abruptly, backing away from the bed as if Isabella had struck him. His face cycled through a series of emotions: disbelief, shock, anger, and something that might have been betrayal. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I wish I were." Isabella struggled to sit up, still holding the baby protectively against her chest. "My full name is Isabella Martinez Santos. Elena was Isabella's older sister. We were both named for our great-grandmother. When Elena disappeared, my mother grieved for years, always hoping she would come home." Mrs. O'Brien had gone very quiet, but Isabella could feel the older woman's eyes moving between her and Jacob, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. "The lullaby," Jacob said slowly, as if working through a difficult puzzle. "The way you held yourself, the shape of your face. My God, I thought you reminded me of her, but I never imagined—" "You couldn't have known," Isabella said gently. "Elena obviously never told you about her family." "She said they were all dead." Jacob's voice was flat, emotionless. "She said there was no one left who cared about her." The words hit Isabella like a slap. Elena had told Jacob their family was dead, rather than admit she had run away and abandoned them. It was a cruel lie that had prevented any possibility of reconciliation. "Our mother is still alive," Isabella said quietly. "That's why Carlos came tonight. She's dying of consumption and wants to see Elena's child before she passes." Jacob turned back to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the room, a different kind of tempest was building. "So, when you came to that auction," Jacob said without turning around, "you knew who I was. You knew I was Elena's husband." "No," Isabella said desperately. "I swear to you, I had no idea. I thought Elena was still alive somewhere. I never heard that she had married or that she had died. The name Harrison meant nothing to me, but when I mentioned her name at dinner, that's when I realized the truth. That's why I fainted." Jacob finally turned to face her, and Isabella saw something in his eyes that made her heart sink. He looked at her like she was a stranger, worse, like she was someone who had deliberately deceived him. "You've had hours to tell me the truth, Isabella. Hours when you knew exactly who I was and what Elena meant to me. Yet you said nothing." "I didn't know how," Isabella protested. "How do you tell someone that the woman they're grieving for was your sister? How do you explain that she never mentioned having a family who loved her?" "She did mention you," Jacob said quietly, and Isabella's breath caught. "She had nightmares sometimes, especially toward the end. She would cry out for someone named Bella, begging forgiveness for leaving her behind. The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow. Elena had thought about her, had regretted leaving her. All these years, Isabella had wondered if her sister had simply forgotten about the family she'd left behind. "She never stopped loving you," Jacob continued, his voice softening slightly. "But she was terrified that if she tried to contact you, your parents would force her to come home. She said she couldn't go back to the life she'd had before." Isabella thought about their childhood, the poverty, their father's drinking, their mother's constant worry about making ends meet. Elena had always been the dreamer, the one who talked about adventure and seeing the world beyond their small, mining town. "Our father died when I was 16, Isabella said quietly. "Mama and I struggled, but we managed. Eleanor could have come home any time after that." "She didn't know," Jacob said. "She was afraid to find out what had happened to the family she'd left behind." The baby stirred in Isabella's arms, making soft mewing sounds. Isabella looked down at her daughter, Eleanor's niece, and felt the weight of everything that had been lost to pride and fear and miscommunication. "Jacob," she said softly, "I know this changes everything between us. I know you probably hate me for not telling you sooner. But this baby, she's Eleanor's blood. She's the only piece of your wife that still exists in this world." Jacob's eyes moved to the infant, and Isabella saw his expression soften despite his anger. "Elena always wanted a daughter. She said she would name her Rose after your grandmother." "Elena Rose," Isabella said impulsively. "Could we call her Elena Rose? It would honor both our grandmother and your wife." For a long moment, Jacob said nothing. He just stared at the baby with an expression Isabella couldn't read. Finally, he moved closer to the bed and extended his hand toward the infant. "May I?" he asked quietly. Isabella nodded, carefully transferring the baby to Jacob's arms. He held Elena Rose with the reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious, and Isabella saw tears gathering in his storm-grey eyes. "She has Elena's nose," he whispered, and the same stubborn set to her mouth. Mrs. O'Brien, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps we should let Isabella rest now. It's been a very long night for everyone." Jacob nodded, reluctantly handing the baby back to Isabella. "We'll talk more tomorrow, when you've recovered from the birth. There's a lot we need to discuss." As he moved toward the door, Isabella called out to him, "Jacob, are you going to send me away?" He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. "I don't know, Isabella. I honestly don't know." After he left, Mrs. O'Brien bustled around the room, cleaning up and checking on both Isabella and the baby. But Isabella could sense the older woman's confusion and concern. "Mrs. O'Brien," Isabella said finally, "I know this is shocking. I know. It seems like I've deceived everyone." "Have you?" Mrs. O'Brien asked bluntly. Isabella considered the question honestly. "Not intentionally. But I did keep silent when I should have spoken up. I was afraid of how Jacob would react, and I was selfish. Enough to want to learn more about Elena before I revealed the truth." Mrs. O'Brien sat down in the rocking chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Eleanor never spoke of family, but I always suspected there was more to her story. She had the look of someone carrying secrets." "She was ashamed," Isabella said, quietly. "Ashamed of where she came from, maybe ashamed of leaving us behind, but she built a beautiful life here with Jacob." "That she did. And now you're here with her niece, and Mr. Jacob doesn't know what to make of any of it." Isabella looked down at baby Elena Rose, who was sleeping peacefully despite the emotional storm that had surrounded her birth. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" "That's not for me to say, dear. But I will tell you this. In all the years I've known Jacob Harrison, I've never seen him care about anyone the way he was caring about you tonight. A man doesn't hold a woman's hand through childbirth unless his heart is already engaged. But now that he knows who I am, now that he knows who you are, things will be complicated. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Jacob has been living with Elena's ghost for 2 years. Maybe learning that part of her still exists in the world will help him find a way to move forward. Isabella hoped Mrs. O'Brien was right, but as she listened to the storm beginning to abate outside her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. She had found her sister's husband and given birth to her sister's niece, but in doing so, she had opened wounds that might never heal. As dawn approached and baby Eleanor Rose slept peacefully in her arms, Isabella whispered a prayer to whatever saints might be listening. She prayed for Jacob's forgiveness, for her mother's health, and for the strength to navigate the impossible situation she had created. Most of all, she prayed that love, in all its complicated forms, would be enough to see them through whatever came next. Dawn broke grey and subdued over the Double H Ranch, the storm having exhausted itself during the night like a spent rage. Isabella woke to the sound of men's voices drifting up from the yard below, and the gentle weight of baby Eleanor, Rose sleeping against her chest. Every muscle in her body ached from the ordeal of childbirth, but it was the uncertainty in her heart that truly made her feel fragile. Through her window, she could see Jacob and Carlos standing by the barn, their conversation too distant to overhear, but their body language speaking volumes. Carlos gestured emphatically toward the house, while Jacob stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Dr. Morrison's buggy sat nearby, steam rising from his horse's flanks. In the cool morning air, a soft knock at the door interrupted her observation. "Come in," Isabella called quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. Dr. Morrison entered, his medical bag in hand, and his expression professionally cheerful. "Good morning, new mother. How are you feeling?" "Sore, but well enough," Isabella replied, shifting carefully in the bed. "Is the baby healthy?" "From what I can see, she's perfect. But let me give you both a proper examination now that I'm here." Dr. Morrison set down his bag and began washing his hands in the basin Mrs. O'Brien had left. "I understand congratulations are in order, and that there were some surprising revelations last night." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. O'Brien told you." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if searching for answers written there. "Then I would say that watching you hold our daughter—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what he had said. "Our daughter?" Isabella repeated softly. Color rose in Jacob's cheeks. "I didn't mean. That is, I know she's not actually. But you feel like she is." Jacob nodded slowly. "From the moment I held her, something in my chest loosened for the first time in 2 years. She's not my blood, but she feels like mine." Isabella felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Elena Rose is lucky to have you care for her, regardless of biology." "And you?" Jacob asked quietly. "Do you want me to care for her? For both of you?" The question hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse entirely. Isabella looked down at baby Elena Rose, then back up at Jacob's face, seeing hope and fear warring in his expression. "I want whatever is best for her," Isabella said carefully. "And right now, that means having a father who already loves her, and a home where she's wanted. Even if that father bought her mother at an auction." Isabella managed a small smile. "Especially then. You saved us both, Jacob. The circumstances don't change that fact." A commotion in the yard below interrupted them. Carlos was arguing with Mrs. O'Brien, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. Isabella could make out phrases in Spanish, his tone growing increasingly agitated. "He's getting impatient," Jacob observed. "How much do you want to tell him about Elena?" Isabella considered this. Carlos had known Elena as a child. He had been one of the few relatives who had genuinely mourned her disappearance. Learning that she had died so recently would devastate him, but he deserved to know the truth. Everything, Isabella decided. Carlos loved Elena like a daughter. He has a right to know what happened to her, and he'll want to help us get Elena Rose to see my mother. Jacob nodded. Then we should go downstairs and explain the situation. But Isabella, he paused at the door. Whatever happens with your mother, whatever Carlos wants, I want you to know that you and Elena Rose have a home here for as long as you want it. Even though I'm bound to you by contract for 5 years, Jacob's expression grew serious. Forget the contract. I'm offering you a choice, Isabella. Stay because you want to, not because you have to. After he left, Isabella sat holding her daughter and contemplating the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a desperate woman sold at auction. Now she was a new mother, being offered love and security by a man who had every reason to resent her deception. Mrs. O'Brien bustled in with a breakfast tray, her face flushed from her argument with Carlos. That man is determined to cart you off today, storm or no storm. I told him he'd have to go through me first. Mrs. O'Brien, we're going to tell Carlos about Elena. He deserves to know the whole truth. The older woman's expression softened. That will be hard for him to hear. He was quite fond of Elena when she was young. But it will also help him understand why this baby is so important and why Jacob is willing to escort us to Pueblo. Mrs. O'Brien helped Isabella into a clean dress and fixed her hair, clucking over her like a mother hen. You know, dear, in all my years on this ranch, I've never seen Mr. Jacob as happy as he was, holding that baby this morning. He thinks he's confused about his feelings for me. Men always think they're confused when they're actually just scared, Mrs. O'Brien said with a knowing smile. Give him time to sort through his emotions. What he feels for you is real, whether you're Elena's sister or not. As Isabella prepared to go downstairs and face Carlos with the truth about Elena, she found herself hoping that Mrs. O'Brien was right. Because despite everything, the auction, the deception, the complicated family history, she was beginning to realize that her own feelings for Jacob Harrison were growing stronger by the hour. The question now was whether love could triumph over the complex circumstances that had brought them together, or whether the weight of the past would prove too heavy for their fragile new beginning to bear. The kitchen of the Double H ranch house had never held such tension. Carlos Martinez paced back and forth across the worn wooden floor, his boots echoing with each agitated step, while Jacob sat at the head of the long table with his hands folded carefully in front of him. Mrs. O'Brien bustled between the stove and the table, her nervous energy manifesting in unnecessary adjustments to already perfect place settings. Isabella descended the stairs slowly, baby Elena Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms. Each step sent small jolts of pain through her still healing body, but she forced herself to move with dignity. This conversation would determine not only her immediate future, but possibly the rest of her life. Isabella, mija, Carlos said, rushing to help her into a chair. You should not be out of bed so soon after giving birth. I'm fine, Carlos. We need to talk. Isabella settled into the chair Jacob pulled out for her, acutely aware of the way his fingers brushed her shoulder as he helped her sit. Carlos resumed his pacing, his weathered face creased with worry. Your mama, she grows weaker every day. The priest has already given her last rites once, but she fights on, asking for you constantly. We must leave today if we're going to reach her in time. Carlos, sit down, Isabella said gently. There are things you need to know before we make any decisions about traveling. Something in her tone must have warned him, because Carlos slowly lowered himself into the chair across from her. His dark eyes moved from Isabella's face to the baby in her arms, then to Jacob's carefully neutral expression. What things? Carlos asked warily. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 2 years' worth of secrets pressing down on her chest. Carlos, do you remember Elena, my sister who disappeared when I was 12? Carlos's face immediately darkened with old grief. Of course I remember Elena. Breaking your poor mama's heart, running off like that without a word. We searched for months, sent letters to every town within 100 miles, nothing. Elena didn't disappear, Carlos. She came here, to Colorado Territory. She married Jacob Harrison. Isabella paused, watching the confusion spread across her cousin's features. The baby I named Elena Rose. I named her after my sister. Carlos stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly struggling to process this information. Your sister came here? She married this man? He gestured toward Jacob. Where is she now? Why did she never write to tell us she was safe? Jacob leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Elena died 2 years ago, Mr. Martinez. She and our unborn child both died of typhoid fever. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, shock, pain, and finally a grief so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds. Elena is dead, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Carlos, Isabella said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I only learned the truth myself yesterday evening. Elena lived here as Jacob's wife for several years. She was loved and cherished, but she never contacted the family. Carlos buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. O'Brien quietly placed a cup of coffee in front of him and retreated to give the family privacy. All these years, Carlos said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. All these years, your mama blamed herself for Eleanor running away. She thought if she had been a better mother, if she had protected Elena more from your father's anger. Elena told Jacob that our family was dead, Isabella said quietly. She wanted to start completely over, with no ties to the past. Carlos looked up sharply. She told him we were dead, Jacob nodded grimly. Elena said she had no family left in the world. I believed her completely. But why? Carlos demanded. Yes, your father could be harsh, but Elena was never in any real danger from him. Why would he? She cut us off so completely? Isabella exchanged a look with Jacob, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. I don't know, Carlos. Maybe she was ashamed of where she came from, or maybe she was afraid that if she maintained contact, you would all pressure her to come home. We would have, Carlos said fiercely. Your mama cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years after Elena left. Of course we would have tried to bring her home, and maybe that's exactly what Elena was afraid of, Jacob said quietly. She told me once that going back to her old life would feel like dying. Perhaps she thought a clean break was the only way to truly escape. Carlos stared at Jacob with a mixture of resentment and curiosity. You loved her? More than my own life, Jacob replied without hesitation. And she was happy here? Jacob's expression softened. I believe so. Elena laughed every day, sang while she worked, filled this house with joy. She seemed to find peace here that she couldn't find anywhere else. Carlos was quiet for a long time, absorbing this information. Finally, he looked at Isabella with new understanding. And now you're here with Elena's husband carrying Elena's niece. Dios mío, the circles life makes. It gets more complicated, Isabella said carefully. Carlos, Jacob bought my contract at a debtor's auction in Canyon City. I'm legally bound to work here for 5 years to pay off my debts. Carlos's face flushed with renewed anger. He bought you, like property. He saved me, Isabella said firmly. The man who was bidding against him, Jacob, rescued me from a terrible situation. But still, to buy a human being... I offered to tear up the contract, Jacob interrupted. Yesterday, before I knew who Isabella was, I told her she could stay or leave as she chose. Learning that she's Elena's sister doesn't change that offer. Carlos studied Jacob's face intently, as if trying to read the truth written there. "And what do you want, Isabella? Do you want to stay here with this man?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella felt Jacob's eyes on her, waiting for her answer, and she realized that her response would set the course for all their futures. "I want to see Mama before she dies," Isabella said carefully. "I want her to meet Elena's niece and to know that Elena found happiness before she passed. But after that," she looked directly at Jacob, "after that, I want to come back here. This baby deserves to grow up knowing the man Elena loved, and I've found something here I didn't expect to find." "What have you found?" Carlos asked. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to be honest. "Hope. For the first time since Miguel died, I have hope for the future." Jacob's face transformed with something that looked very much like relief. He reached across the table and covered Isabella's hand with his own, the gesture unconsciously possessive. Carlos noticed the interaction and shook his head slowly. "This is all very strange, but if it's what you want, mija," he sighed heavily. "How long will it take to prepare for the journey to Pueblo?" "A week," Jacob said. "Dr. Morrison says Isabella needs that much time to recover from the birth before attempting the trip. A week may be too long," Carlos said grimly. "Your mama, she's very weak. The doctor says her lungs are filling with fluid." Isabella felt panic rise in her chest. After everything, finding Elena's husband, giving birth to Elena's niece, would she still arrive too late to give her mother the closure she needed? "Then we leave in 5 days," Jacob said decisively. "I'll hire a wagon with proper springs, for comfort, and Mrs. O'Brien can come along to help with the baby. We'll travel in short stages to minimize the strain on Isabella." "You would do this?" Carlos asked. "You would make such a journey for a woman you barely know." Jacob's hand tightened, slightly on Isabella's. "I would do it for Elena, and I would do it for Isabella and the baby." The next 5 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Jacob had indeed procured a specially modified wagon with extra padding and canvas covers to protect against wind and weather. Mrs. O'Brien packed enough supplies for a small army, fussing over Isabella's health and the baby's feeding schedule with maternal intensity. Isabella found herself growing stronger each day, both physically and emotionally. The terrible weakness that had followed Elena Rose's birth was fading, replaced by a determination to see her mother and a growing certainty about her feelings for Jacob. Those feelings were complicated by the increasing intimacy of their daily interactions. Jacob helped her up and down stairs without being asked, brought her tea when she was nursing the baby, and spent long evenings sitting by her bedside talking about Eleanor, about his dreams for the ranch, about his hopes for Eleanor. Rose's future. "She'll need to learn to read," Jacob said one evening, gently rocking the baby while Isabella rested. "Elena always said education was the key to freedom for women. Elena could barely sit still long enough to learn her letters when we were children," Isabella observed with a smile. "I was always the studious one. Then you'll teach her. Elena Rose will have the best of both her namesakes." These conversations felt dangerously close to planning a shared future, and Isabella found herself treasuring each word, each glance, each accidental touch. But she also worried that Jacob's feelings were still confused by grief and the shock of discovering her connection to Elena. 2 nights before their planned departure, those worries came to a head during a conversation that neither of them had intended to have. Isabella was nursing Elena Rose by the fireplace in her room when Jacob knocked and entered with a cup of warm milk and honey, a nightly ritual that had developed over the past few days. "How is she tonight?" he asked, settling into the rocking chair. "Hungry and growing stronger every day," Isabella replied. "Dr. Morrison says she's thriving despite the circumstances of her birth." Jacob watched the baby nurse with an expression of wonder that still took Isabella's breath away. She has Elena's determination. Look how fiercely she holds on. Jacob, Isabella said carefully, can I ask you something? Of course. When you look at Elena Rose, do you see her? Do you see my sister? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I see echoes of Elena in her features, yes, but mostly I see you. The shape of her eyes, the way she furrows her brow when she's concentrating, that's all, Isabella. And when you look at me, do you see Elena? Jacob's gaze moved from the baby to Isabella's face, and she saw something shift in his expression. At first, yes, the resemblance was what drew my attention at the auction. But Isabella, he leaned forward, his voice growing intense. You are nothing like Elena in personality. She was light and laughter and joy, but you have depths Elena never possessed. You have a strength that comes from surviving real hardship, a compassion that's been tested by loss. Isabella felt her breath catch. Is that good or bad? It's perfect, Jacob said simply. Elena was the love of my youth, but you could be the love of my maturity. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the honesty in Jacob's voice. Jacob, I need you to understand something. Whatever this is between us, it can't be built on Elena's memory. I won't be a replacement for her. You're not a replacement, Jacob said fiercely. You're something entirely new, something I never expected to find. Before Isabella could respond, a commotion erupted in the yard outside. Horses' hooves thundered across the ground, and men's voices shouted urgent words she couldn't quite make out. Jacob was at the window in an instant, his face growing grim as he peered into the darkness. Riders coming hard. Something's wrong. The sound of boots on the front porch was followed immediately by urgent pounding on the door. Mrs. O'Brien's voice could be heard from downstairs, followed by the rumble of male voices speaking rapidly, in Spanish. Carlos, Isabella said, recognizing her cousin's voice even through the floor. Something's happened. Jacob was already moving toward the door. Stay here with the baby. I'll find out what's going on. But Isabella was already struggling. To her feet, baby Elena Rose clutched protectively against her chest. If it's about my mother, I need to know. They made their way downstairs together, Isabella moving as quickly as her still healing body would allow. In the front parlor, they found Carlos with two other men Isabella didn't recognize, all of them travel-stained and exhausted. Carlos, Isabella said, and the fear in her voice made baby Elena Rose stir restlessly. Carlos turned toward her, his face etched with grief and urgency. Isabella, mija, we have to leave tonight. Right now. What's happened? Your mama. She took a turn. For the worse yesterday. The doctor says she has maybe 1 day, possibly 2, if we don't reach Pueblo by tomorrow evening. Isabella felt the room tilt around her. Tonight? But I'm not ready. The baby isn't ready for such a hard journey. We'll make it work. Jacob said firmly, already moving toward the coat closet. Mrs. O'Brien, start packing immediately. Carlos, how many men did you bring? 3, counting myself. We have fresh horses and supplies for the journey. Then we ride hard and switch mounts when needed. Jacob's voice was calm and decisive, the voice of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions quickly. Isabella, can you handle riding? In a wagon at speed? Isabella thought about her mother dying alone, calling for daughters who might not reach her in time. I can handle whatever I have to handle. The baby, Mrs. O'Brien began. Will come with us, Isabella said firmly. Elena Rose needs to meet her grandmother. It may be the only chance they ever have. As the household erupted into frantic preparation for an emergency journey, Isabella held her daughter close and whispered a prayer. They were about to embark on a desperate race against time, carrying with them the hope of bringing closure to a woman who had spent 10 years mourning one daughter and was now dying without knowing she had a granddaughter. But even as fear gripped Isabella's heart, she found strength in the man working tirelessly beside her, the man who was risking everything to help her reach her mother in time. Whatever the outcome of their journey, she knew with absolute certainty that Jacob Harrison had become far more than Elena's widower or her contractual owner. He had become the man she loved, and she was finally ready to tell him so. The journey to Pueblo became a race against death itself. Through the night, their small caravan pushed relentlessly across mountain terrain that tested both horses and riders. Isabella cradled baby Elena Rose against her chest, wrapped in layers of blankets to protect against the mountain cold, while Jacob drove the wagon with the skill of a man who had navigated these treacherous paths many times before. Mrs. O'Brien sat beside Isabella, one steady hand on her shoulder, as the wagon bounced over rocky ground and through shallow creek beds. "Hold tight, dear one," she murmured during the worst jolts. "We're almost through the pass." By dawn, they had covered more ground than Isabella had thought possible. The horses were lathered with sweat despite the cold, and even Carlos looked haggard as he rode alongside the wagon. But when Isabella asked how much farther, his answer filled her with hope. 3 hours, maybe 4. We'll reach Pueblo before noon." Jacob's hands were steady on the reins, but Isabella could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. He had driven through the night without complaint, stopping only to rest the horses and allow Isabella to nurse the baby in the shelter of rocks or trees. During one such stop, as Mrs. O'Brien walked the baby to give Isabella a few moments of rest, Jacob approached with obvious concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling beside her on a fallen log. "Better than I expected," Isabella said honestly. "But Jacob, you look ready to collapse. Let Carlos drive for a while." Jacob shook his head. "These mountain roads require someone who knows every dip and turn. One wrong move with a baby in the wagon." He didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. She reached out and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you for all of this. Elena would be—" "Isabella," Jacob interrupted gently. "This isn't about Elena. This is about you and Elena Rose, and the family you both deserve to have." Isabella's breath caught at the word family. "Is that what we are? A family?" Jacob's storm-grey eyes met hers directly. "I'd like us to be, if you'll have me." Before Isabella could respond, Mrs. O'Brien returned with the baby, and they were on the road again. But Jacob's words echoed in Isabella's heart as the miles passed beneath the wagon wheels. They reached Pueblo just as the church bells were ringing. At noon, Carlos led them through narrow streets to a small adobe house on the outskirts of town, where smoke rose weakly from the chimney and a priest's horse stood tethered to the porch rail. Isabella's heart sank. If Father Miguel was here, it meant her mother's time was nearly spent. "Isabella, mija," Carlos said gently, helping her down from the wagon. "Your mama is very weak. The journey, the excitement of meeting the baby, it might be too much for her." "She's held on this long to see me," Isabella replied, adjusting baby Elena Rose in her arms. "She deserves to meet her granddaughter." The house was dim and filled with the scent of candle wax and medicinal herbs. Isabella's mother, Maria Martinez, lay propped up in a narrow bed near the window, her once robust frame reduced to a fragile shell. But when she saw Isabella enter with the baby, her eyes blazed with a light that defied her body's weakness. "Isabella," she whispered, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "My daughter, you came." Isabella knelt beside the bed, baby Elena Rose stirring in her arms. I'm here, Mama, and I brought someone very special to meet you. Maria's eyes moved to the baby, and her expression transformed with wonder. Is this my granddaughter? Yes, Mama. This is Elena Rose. Isabella paused, knowing the next words would change everything. Mama, I have news about Elena, about my sister. Maria's breathing became more labored, but her attention was absolute. Elena, have you heard from her? Isabella took her mother's frail hand, choosing her words carefully. Mama, Elena didn't disappear. She came to Colorado Territory and married a good man named Jacob Harrison. She was happy, Mama. She had a home and love and everything she ever dreamed of. Where is she now? Maria asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already suspected the answer. Elena died 2 years ago, Mama. She and her unborn baby died of fever. But she lived a full life first, a happy life. Maria closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids. All these years, I blamed myself for driving her away. I thought if I had been stronger, if I had protected her better from your father's temper. Elena's choice wasn't about you, Mama. She was searching for something she couldn't find at home, and she found it. Isabella looked back toward the door, where Jacob waited respectfully outside. Jacob loved her completely. She never wanted him for anything. This baby, Maria whispered, reaching toward Elena Rose with trembling fingers. She carries Elena's name. Elena Rose, after our grandmother and my sister. She's Elena's niece, Mama, the last piece of her legacy. Maria's face crumpled with emotion as she touched the baby's tiny hand. Elena Rose opened her dark eyes and stared up at her grandmother with the solemn gaze of the very young. She has Elena's eyes, Maria breathed. But the shape of her face, that's you, Mija. Mama, there's something else. Jacob Harrison, Elena's husband. He's offered to marry me, to give Elena Rose a father and me a home. Maria's eyes sharpened despite her weakness. Do you love him? Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. Yes, Mama, I do. And he loves you, not just as Elena's sister. I believe so. He says I'm nothing like Elena, that what he feels for me is completely separate from what he felt for her. Maria nodded slowly. Then you have my blessing, Mija. Elena found her happiness, and now you found yours. She paused, struggling for breath. But promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll name your next child after me. I want some part of this family to continue even after I'm gone. Isabella felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I promise. Mama! Over the next hour, Maria held baby Elena Rose and listened to Isabella tell the complete story. The auction, Jacob's kindness, the revelation of Elena's identity, and the strange paths that had brought them all together. When she grew too tired to speak, she simply watched her granddaughter with eyes full of love and peace. As the afternoon light began to fade, Maria beckoned Isabella closer. Bring him in, she whispered. I want to meet the man who loved my Elena and now loves my Isabella. Jacob entered the small room with his hat in his hands, his face respectful and grave. Maria studied him with the intensity of a mother protecting her young. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice barely audible, you made my Elena happy. I tried to, Mom. She brought joy to every day of our marriage. And my Isabella, will you make her happy too? Jacob's eyes moved to Isabella, and she saw absolute certainty in his gaze. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to, if she'll let me. Maria smiled, the expression transforming her face despite her illness. Then you have my blessing. Take care of them both. She died that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, baby Elena Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her last words were a whispered, "Thank you," that seemed directed at both her daughters, one who had found love in life, and one who had brought love home to her dying mother. 6 months later, Isabella stood in the parlor of the Double H Ranch house, wearing Elena's wedding dress carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. Mrs. O'Brien had insisted it was appropriate, that Elena would have wanted her sister to wear it for such a joyous occasion. Jacob waited beside the fireplace, handsome in his best suit, while baby Elena Rose gurgled happily in Carlos's arms. The local preacher spoke the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, but Isabella barely heard them. She was too focused on Jacob's face, on the love and wonder she saw there. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Jacob's kiss was gentle, but filled with promise. As they turned to face their small gathering of friends and family, Isabella caught sight of Eleanor's portrait on the mantel. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw her sister smiling. "Are you happy?" Jacob whispered as they accepted congratulations from their guests. Isabella looked around the room that had become her home, at the baby who had become their daughter, at the man who had become her everything. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Even though it all started with an auction." Isabella smiled, remembering the desperation and fear of that day in Canyon City, especially because it started with an auction. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just doorways to the best ones. Jacob pulled her closer, his arms strong and warm around her. "Elena Rose is getting hungry," he observed, watching their daughter fuss in Carlos's arms. He had become the man she loved, and she was finally ready to tell him so. The journey to Pueblo became a race against death itself. Through the night, their small caravan pushed relentlessly across mountain terrain that tested both horses and riders. Isabella cradled baby Elena Rose against her chest, wrapped in layers of blankets to protect against the mountain cold, while Jacob drove the wagon with the skill of a man who had navigated these treacherous paths many times before. Mrs. O'Brien sat beside Isabella, one steady hand on her shoulder as the wagon bounced over rocky ground and through shallow creek beds. "Hold tight, dear one," she murmured during the worst jolts. "We're almost through the pass." By dawn, they had covered more ground than Isabella had thought possible. The horses were lathered with sweat despite the cold, and even Carlos looked haggard as he rode alongside the wagon. But when Isabella asked how much farther, his answer filled her with hope. 3 hours, maybe 4. We'll reach Pueblo before noon." Jacob's hands were steady on the reins, but Isabella could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. He had driven through the night without complaint, stopping only to rest the horses and allow Isabella to nurse the baby in the shelter of rocks or trees. During one such stop, as Mrs. O'Brien walked the baby to give Isabella a few moments of rest, Jacob approached with obvious concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling beside her on a fallen log. "Better than I expected," Isabella said honestly. "But Jacob, you look ready to collapse. Let Carlos drive for a while." Jacob shook his head. "These mountain roads require someone who knows every dip and turn. One wrong move with a baby in the wagon." He didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. She reached out and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you for all of this. Elena would be—" "Isabella," Jacob interrupted gently. "This isn't about Elena. This is about you and Elena Rose and the family you both deserve to have." Isabella's breath caught at the word family. "Is that what we are? A family?" Jacob's storm-grey eyes met hers directly. "I'd like us to be, if you'll have me." Before Isabella could respond, Mrs. O'Brien returned with the baby, and they were on the road again. But Jacob's words echoed in Isabella's heart as the miles passed beneath the wagon wheels. They reached Pueblo just as the church bells were ringing. At noon, Carlos led them through narrow streets to a small adobe house on the outskirts of town, where smoke rose weakly from the chimney and a priest's horse stood tethered to the porch rail. Isabella's heart sank. If Father Miguel was here, It meant her mother's time was nearly spent. Isabella, mija, Carlos said gently, helping her down from the wagon. Your mama is very weak. The journey, the excitement of meeting the baby, it might be too much for her. She's held on this long to see me, Isabella replied, adjusting baby Eleanor Rose in her arms. She deserves to meet her granddaughter. The house was dim and filled with the scent of candle wax and medicinal herbs. Isabella's mother, Maria Martinez, lay propped up in a narrow bed near the window, her once robust frame reduced to a fragile shell. But when she saw Isabella enter with the baby, her eyes blazed with a light that defied her body's weakness. Isabella, she whispered, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. My daughter, you came. Isabella knelt beside the bed, baby Elena Rose stirring in her arms. I'm here, Mama, and I brought someone very special to meet you. Maria's eyes moved to the baby, and her expression transformed with wonder. Is this my granddaughter? Yes, Mama, this is Elena Rose. Isabella paused, knowing the next words would change everything. Mama, I have news about Elena, about my sister. Maria's breathing became more labored, but her attention was absolute. Elena, have you heard from her? Isabella took her mother's frail hand, choosing her words carefully. Mama, Elena didn't disappear. She came to Colorado Territory and married a good man named Jacob Harrison. She was happy, Mama. She had a home and love and everything she ever dreamed of. Where is she now? Maria asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already suspected the answer. Elena died 2 years ago, Mama. She and her unborn baby died of fever. But she lived a full life first, a happy life. Maria closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids. All these years, I blame myself for driving her away. I thought if I had been stronger, if I had protected her better from your father's temper. Elena's choice wasn't about you, Mama. She was searching for something she couldn't find at home, and she found it. Isabella looked back toward the door where Jacob waited respectfully outside. Jacob loved her completely. She never wanted for anything. This baby, Maria whispered, reaching toward Elena Rose with trembling fingers. She carries Elena's name? Elena Rose, after our grandmother and my sister. She's Elena's niece, Mama, the last piece of her legacy. Maria's face crumpled with emotion as she touched the baby's tiny hand. Elena Rose opened her dark eyes and stared up at her grandmother with the solemn gaze of the very young. She has Elena's eyes, Maria breathed. But the shape of her face, that's you, mija. Mama, there's something else. Jacob Harrison, Elena's husband, he's offered to marry me, to give Elena Rose a father and me a home. Maria's eyes sharpened despite her weakness. Do you love him? Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. Yes, Mama, I do. And he loves you, not just as Elena's sister. I believe so. He says I'm nothing like Elena, that what he feels for me is completely separate from what he felt for her. Maria nodded slowly. Then you have my blessing, mija. Elena found her happiness, and now you found yours. She paused, struggling for breath. But promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll name your next child after me. I want some part of this family to continue even after I'm gone. Isabella felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I promise, Mama. Over the next hour, Maria held baby Eleanor Rose and listened to Isabella tell the complete story. The auction, Jacob's kindness, the revelation of Eleanor's identity, and the strange paths that had brought them all together. When she grew too tired to speak, she simply watched her granddaughter with eyes full of love and peace. As the afternoon light began to fade, Maria beckoned Isabella closer. Bring him in, she whispered. I want to meet the man who loved my Elena and now loves my Isabella." Jacob entered the small room with his hat in his hands, his face respectful and grave. Maria studied him with the intensity of a mother protecting her young. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice barely audible, "you made my Elena happy." "I tried to, Mom. She brought joy to every day of our marriage. And my Isabella, will you make her happy too?" Jacob's eyes moved to Isabella, and she saw absolute certainty in his gaze. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to, if she'll let me." Maria smiled, the expression transforming her face despite her illness. "Then you have my blessing. Take care of them both." She died that evening as the sun set behind the mountains. Baby Eleanor rose, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her last words were a whispered thank you that seemed directed at both her daughters, one who had found love in life, and one who had brought love home to her dying mother. 6 months later, Isabella stood in the parlor of the Double H Ranch house, wearing Elena's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. Mrs. O'Brien had insisted it was appropriate, that Elena would have wanted her sister to wear it for such a joyous occasion. Jacob waited beside the fireplace, handsome in his best suit, while baby Elena Rose gurgled happily in Carlos's arms. The local preacher spoke the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, but Isabella barely heard them. She was too focused on Jacob's face, on the love and wonder she saw there. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Jacob's kiss was gentle, but filled with promise. As they turned to face their small gathering of friends and family, Isabella caught sight of Elena's portrait on the mantel. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw her sister smiling. "Are you happy?" Jacob whispered as they accepted congratulations from their guests. Isabella looked around the room that had become her home, at the baby who had become their daughter, at the man who had become her everything. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Even though it all started with an auction?" Isabella smiled, remembering the desperation and fear of that day in Canyon City. "Especially because it started with an auction. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just doorways to the best ones." Jacob pulled her closer, his arms strong and warm around her. "Elena Rose is getting hungry," he observed, watching their daughter fuss in Carlos's arms. "Our daughter," Isabella corrected gently, savoring the words. "Elena Rose Harrison." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Isabella nursed her daughter, while her husband read aloud from a book of poetry. Mrs. O'Brien hummed in the kitchen as she prepared dinner, and Carlos entertained the guests with stories of Isabella's childhood. It was a scene of perfect domestic happiness, made all the more precious by the difficult path that had led them there. Isabella had been sold at auction like property, but she had found something more valuable than freedom. She had found love, family, and a future filled with hope. The portrait of Eleanor Harrison smiled down on them all, and Isabella whispered, a silent thank you to the sister she had lost and found again in the strangest of ways. Elena's legacy lived on in the baby at Isabella's breast, in the man who loved them both, and in the family they were building together on the foundation of loss, love, and the miraculous second chances that life sometimes offers to those who need them most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.